So let me share my screen. And the first thing I want to take just a minute discussing is the schedule. Especially the first time you're teaching a class, you've got two things you have to kind of be balancing as you go along. One is, this is the first time I've been through the material, and when I put it on paper, it all made sense. Now that we're doing it, after finishing yesterday's lesson, really the next logical step for us, given the level of technology and, to be quite honest, the work ethic that y'all have shown, I think we're ready to move on and do a full REST API presentation. And to me, that made the most logical sense for the next presentation. So I thought we'd do that. And then we would push off Redis and server-side routing to Thursday. We actually had a little bit of flex time on Thursday, so it made sense to move those there and do our full REST API right now. We kind of toyed with that yesterday, but it's time to really jump into it. And then tomorrow we'll still do the RabbitMQ and middleware that's on the schedule. So I just wanted, that won't happen often, but I wanted to make that change because it just made the most sense. The other thing that I want to mention is, get that out of the way. Okay. The other thing I want to mention is they're doing special career sessions, career coaching for y'all this round. Take advantage of that. One of the things about applying for jobs, yes, having the technical skills is important. Having the work skills is incredibly important, and being good, decent people, which the people that I have to say, the people that I have interacted with, students and PMs that I've interacted with at Lambda have been phenomenal people. So you've got those two down, but really what you need after that is a foot in the door. So you can convince them that you have the first two. And the career coaches at Lambda are really good at getting you that foot in the door. So take advantage of everything that they offer. If you're looking for a job, that's the way to go. I have to work on quit hitting my glasses. Is the career sessions, the career coaches at lunchtime? Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Very good. Thank you for clarifying my terminology. All right, let's get started. So I said we were going to do a full REST API. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to take a project. We're actually going to take our employee project that we worked on yesterday, but we're going to really flush it out. We're going to put all the little bells and whistles in that we would need for a REST API. So when we're done with this, we're going to have some web services that our client, and I'll show you the client inside of IntelliJ that you can use. There were two things that were mentioned yesterday that I just kind of skipped over. One was, what about a REST client? And the other was, is there a way we can read JSON better than just having it scroll on the screen? And with this project, I'm going to answer both of those as we go along. But what I want to do, like I said, is kind of throw in all of the bells and whistles. Now, if you go look into how to do REST APIs in Java, you're going to get a lot of different advice. I'm going to follow the logic and the advice that is given by Spring, the people that do our framework. To me, that makes the most sense. We're relying a lot on their framework, so let's use it. And yes, we're actually going to be using JPA, Java Persistence API, and we're also going to be using H2, which is a type of database. We'll get to that in just a second. If you don't know about what in the world REST APIs are or what in the world databases are, that's okay. I think most of us do because we've been through the Lambda program. And in the future, I will make sure to cover databases before I cover this topic. But for right now, most of us know what a database is. And if you don't, just think of it as another collection. We had array list, we had hash maps, now we have databases, and you interact with them a little differently. The real positive thing about that is as we go forward, their data will be persistent, meaning that when you exit the program, it's going to stay around. REST APIs, really, if you just think of it basically as a way for a client to interact with your web services in a defined manner, that's going to be enough that you need to get through the project today and to do the afternoon assignment. Okay, let's get started. All right, I'm going to create a new project. So I fired up IntelliJ. I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to use the Spring Initializer just like we did yesterday. Want to make sure we're on the Java Development Kit 11. Everything else looks good here, so I'm going to go to Next. And this is actually a good time to be following along because we're going to, like I said, we're going to build this project like we normally do. And then at the end, you'll have some really good sample code to work on the afternoon assignment. All right. Let's call this Lambda School, like I've been doing. For my artifact, I'm going to call it RESTful Imps. And the artifact name has to be all lowercase. We're still going to use just a Java file. We'll be talking about the jar file. We'll be talking about the WAR file on Thursday. We do want version 11. And I'm going to put down here REST API project for Spring Boot. I like that. Okay. Now, here are some things that are going to be a little bit different. First of all, just like we did, we're going to include DevTools. We're going to include the web. So I've got DevTools and I've got the web. Now, there's a few others we want to include. One thing that we want to include is the thing called Lombok. And Lombok, let's see, it's under core, so let's go see what it does. Lombok says it's an annotation library which helps to reduce boilerplate code and code faster. And really, it allows us to use those annotations, the at something, instead of having to write a whole bunch of code. Where we're really going to use it a lot is in two areas. One is to help us log things. And so we can log things to our screen to see what's going on. And the other is to do the getters and setters. And I think you'll like it. We also want to use something called, I pronounce it Hadios. I've heard many different pronunciations. Hadios is what I like. Hadios then is actually found under web. And it allows us to do, we can do RESTful services using just the web. Hadios just adds another layer that makes it easier for us. So we're going to add that in there and you'll see how we make use of it as we go along. Now, I said we were also going to work with a database. And most of us know what a database is, a place to store data. Usually, if it's a SQL database, you have tables and you have columns and that sort of thing. We don't really have to worry about all that right now. What we really need to do is just think of it as another way to store data, another collection, like our array list or our hash maps. Now, the particular database we're going to use, the particular database that we're going to use is called H2. And the reason that we're going to use H2 is that it's an embedded database, and everyone that works with Java and Spring, H2 is the thing that they use to do all their local testing and everything. So we're just going to use H2. You can easily, as we go through, we'll show you about this, that's going to be with JPA. You can easily switch out H2 from doing all your local programming using H2 you can easily switch out a more enterprise-wide database like ML SQL, Oracle, something like that for H2 if later on. But for doing local development and testing, H2 is the way to go. And then we have one more thing we need to install, and that's JPA. And JPA is the Java Persistent API. And what this does is this does a couple of things for us. First of all, it helps us with our database connections, making it so that in Java, we just have to worry about connecting to the database. How all that happens gets pushed off to some libraries. This also really helps us with the SQL databases that we're going to be using store everything in tables and columns. Java stores everything in objects. Somewhere in there, we need to do a mapping. And this object relational mapping that it talks about right here, that is part of JPA. So let's add that as well. So when we're starting with this, notice we've got a lot of dependencies going here. We've got DevTools, we've got Lombok, Web, Helios, JPA, and H2. It'd be good to remember those because you'll need those for your afternoon projects. And also, this is a fairly standard set that people will be installing when they start a RESTful application. Okay, let's get started. So I've got that list. All right, so this next page should have everything on there that we needed. Hang on a second, I want to do something. Realizing that I have not made much printed material available, I'm going to give you that list out in the thread that Thomas had created for us. So there's the list of things that we just installed, or the dependencies that we selected. All right, let's go on. This all looks good. Just going to take the defaults here. You're going to get a couple of messages that pop up here. You're going to get something that says, of course, the Maven projects, do you need to auto-enable? You will also get something that says that the Lombok plugin needs to be installed. So go ahead and do that. That's going to actually force you to exit out of IntelliJ and get back in. But if you'll just follow the prompts and take the defaults, you'll be able to do that. So it actually prompts you right here to go ahead and install that needed plugin. I have already installed my plugin, so it doesn't prompt me to do that. So I'm going to wait about a minute to make sure everyone's plugin gets installed and they get restarted and back into IntelliJ. Okay, so here I'm just looking at the main class that got created for us. This is very similar to what we saw yesterday. And there's really not much we're going to do with this class. So I'm just going to kind of leave that alone. This is a way to kick off our application, as Java needs a main class to kick off its application. And so we have one. All right, let's do something. Let's go create our employee object. I said we were going to work with employee just like we've been working with a few times. We're just going to use it in a different fashion. So let's go create an employee class. So we need an employee class, just like we've been doing. So we get a Java class, and I'm going to call it employee. All right, now first thing I want to do is I want to do an at entity. And notice it adds an import for us up there. What this does is this makes the object ready for JPA storage. So we said we were using this database called H2, and we don't have to worry about creating anything in the database. We just have to worry about using it. And at entity is the thing that's going to say, okay, here's one of the things that we want to use in the database is employee. All right, now let's create some. Let's first of all create some fields, and let's create our ID field. Now, because this is a database, we have a different way that we can create the ID field, which actually makes it much easier for us. Okay, so private at ID, and why are you yelling at me? Of course, it did not yell at me yesterday, you know, because why do that when okay, I want to do one other thing real quick. I'm going to come up here, and it didn't add, and it should have, and this is correct, but I don't know why it didn't automatically add it like it did. We have to add a library, and the library that we need to add is from JavaX persistence. JavaX is actually part of JPA, and the one we want to add is ID. And that's then going to fix ID for us. What we did by putting this annotation ID generated value, this actually creates a primary key. So this creates our key into our database, and it actually gets automatically populated. So we don't have to do any of the bit about worrying about a max ID and keeping track of that. We don't have to worry about assigning an ID anywhere. It's all handled automatically for us by JPA. Now, the rest of the fields are pretty normal stuff. We have a first name. We're going to do a last name. This is what we have seen before. We're going to have, this is what we added yesterday, a has 401k. That's a Boolean value. We're going to put a salary in here, just like we've done. All right. Now, at this point, we want to create a constructor. Don't get ahead. There's a reason for that. You'll see in just a second. At this point, we want to create a constructor. So let's create a constructor. All right, generate constructor, and I want to include everything. Now, normally at this point, we would add getters and setters, right? Okay, except we're going to do that a different way. Because we have this Lombok installed, we're going to come up here, and we're going to do an annotation called data. And this annotation actually creates getters, setters, toString. So the default things that we normally would do, this boilerplate code that we would normally add next with the getters and setters and the toStrings, gets created with this. Now let me show you what I mean by that. So you'll notice we have the constructor. We don't have any getters and setters set. We just have this annotation here. And I want to do one thing before I show you something. We are going to need a default constructor. This is actually something that JPA really likes to have. And so we're going to create a default instructor, meaning that we're going to have a constructor that a library can call that has no parameters. And it's just one of those things is if you're going to be putting the at entity and you're going to be doing the RESTful like we're working on here, this is just something you need to remember to have. Okay. Now this is the end of this code. So I'm going to post this out on the message thread for us. And then I'm going to show you something that's kind of cool. So there's the code that I just wrote. And like I said, we noticed there were no getters and setters. Let's come back over here to our main program. And let me just add some code here. So I'm going to create an employee. I'm going to call it temp. It's going to be a new employee, and that's going to be good enough. Since I have that default constructor, I can do that. Temp dot, notice that we did create a getter for the first name, a getter for the ID, a getter for the last name, a getter for the salary. This is a getter for the Boolean. The way Lombac does it is it creates a is-has 401k for a Boolean. So instead of a get, it uses an is. We can set things, and it created all of this for us automatically by just having that one annotation. We do not need that code, nor do we want it. Okay, great. So now that we have a class, let's go seed some data. Let's go put some data into our collection, into our database. All right, and we're going to do that with something that I'm going to call seed database. Seed database usually means to put some test data in it to see what's going on. All right, so I have this seed database. All right. This actually needs to be part of our Spring network, and we need to tell it that by putting in an annotation called configuration. And what does that do? Well, it declares it indicates that a class declares one or more beans. And then, of course, your next question is going to be, well, what's a bean? Up till now, we've been using what are called, mostly we've been using what are called POJOs, plain old Java objects. And those work great. When we talked about dependency injection, we talked about one of the problems was that if we declare objects inside of other objects, we create objects inside of other objects, that gets to be real messy, and we really want to have that as separated as possible. What a bean is a bean that's controlled by Spring. This is a rough description of a bean. Object or method controlled by Spring contains all of the regular Java stuff plus what I'm going to call metadata about how to configure its dependencies. So a bean does not configure its own dependencies. That information is taken from outside through the Spring framework. All right. So let's actually do that. Let's create a bean. And okay, so we're going to create a thing called command line runner. The command line runner, when Spring Boot, which is one of the frameworks that we're using, so anything that we want to run at startup, we can put inside of this command line runner, provided it's a bean. And then Spring Boot is going to run that at startup for us, which that is perfect for a way to seed a database, because this is something we just need to do once. We need to do it at startup and then we leave it. So we're in good shape. How does this work? Okay. What it does is it returns a Lambda expression of what you want it to do. And in this case, what we want it to do is we want it to do a couple of things. We definitely want to make sure that it adds new data for us. But also, as it's adding the new data, we want to log that fact to our screen. So this is a new thing that we're doing. We want to make sure we have some log info here so people know that this data got added into it. So let's do that. In order to use a log, at least in the way we're going to do it, is we're going to tell this that we're going to use that is an annotation from Lombok that auto creates There we go. So that is a annotation from Lombok that auto creates this SLF4J base logs. And these are very commonly base logs that are used in Spring and used in Java. And it's a standard of how logs can be formatted, and can be manipulated. And we're just going to kind of take use of that and make use of it in Lombok in this project. Okay, so what does all that mean? Well, what I want to do is I need to create, that's basically a collection of these employee objects. They're going to be stored in this database, but I need some way to represent that inside of Java. So let's do that. Okay, let's come over here and let's create an interface. And this interface I want to call employee repository. And it's going to be an interface. And it is going to extend something called the JPA repository. And it's going to contain a couple of things. It's going to be able to work with the employee class, which is good. And for the ID in the employee class, it's of type long. And so what this does is this allows the employee class, based on its ID, to access all of the cool features that are available in JPA. Now we need to tell the seed database that that thing exists. Because right now it doesn't know. We need to tell it that it exists and to use it. So let's do that. So this is the employee repository, and I'm going to call it emp repos. Call it anything you want, but I kind of like imp repos. So I'm going to go with that. Now let's come down here and let's put in our Lambda expression. Okay, we want to log some info. And the info that we want to log is that we are seeding. So we're seeding this particular set of data. And what's going to happen is we're going to create a new employee that we want to save in our database. So first, let's say we're going to save it. And we're going to use this employee repository to access all of our database commands or all of our collection commands. So imp repos, save, and now we need to create a new employee, and we all know how to create a new employee. We've been doing that for several days. And I'm going to use the same data that I've been using, roughly. And there we have now added an employee to our database or to our collection. We created the employee, so now we have this employee object. We saved it to our database, our collection. And then we also logged that out to the screen, and we'll see that in just a second. So that's a whole lot that goes on in that one command. Let's do this again so we have a little bit more data to work with. And I'm going to put one more in. And that's the end of the statement. So this seed database, we told it it was part of the Spring system. So to go ahead and look at it, we created this bean that was called command line runner that's going to say, okay, run this at the start of your application. And inside the command line runner, we return what we want to have run at the start of our application. And in this case, we're going to be creating a new employee. We're going to be saving it to our collection. And then we're going to be logging that information out to the screen. So a lot's going on here. And that's the code that I just worked with. Okay, let's try running this. All right, so I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to click on the run triangle. And it's going to show you some stuff. And specifically, I want you to see down here that those logs that we just added, that we were seeding the employee, it puts them right there. So great. We have data that we can actually work with now. So all that was to get us data that we can work with. I think that would be a great time to take a 5-minute break, get caught up if you're a little behind on coding, and we will regroup in 5 minutes and start actually using this data. My cup says Monahan Sandhill State Park, which is a really cool state park in West Texas. I've been there a lot. I've got my father's family is from West Texas. All right, so let's get started on using this. Now, with REST, REST is an interesting critter. What is called REST? There is such a thing as REST, and there's such a thing as better REST, and then there's such a thing as really good REST. REST doesn't really have it's an idea. It's not really a standard. Unlike SOAP, which is a competing web service standard, SOAP is very defined. We know what SOAP is. REST is kind of fluid. We talk about it as if it's this defined thing when it's really not. So, what we want to do with our REST creation is we're going to create pretty good REST stuff without trying to go overboard with it. In order to do that, we need to create this one piece of helper code. So one of the things with our REST JSON objects that we're going to send back to people is not only is it going to include the data, but then as is recommended, it's going to include the links as to where that data came from. And we need to create a piece of helper code to do that. So I'm going to create a new Java class. And I'm going to call this employee resource. So employee is the class that we're working with. Resource in this case is the URI that points to the object class that we are going to be working with. And then we're going to take a thing called assembler that's going to, and it's part of the Hades framework library that's going to help us kind of combine these things into something that's going to look nice is what it basically boils down to. So we're going to create employee resource assembler. All right, the first thing is it's going to implement resource assembler. And it needs to take two objects. It's going to take the employee class, the thing that we're working with, and then it's going to take a resource that is a collection of these employee objects. Okay, this is going to all make sense in a minute, I bet. We'll see. I do want to back up for just a second. There was one thing I wanted to say. So in the class channel, there's a couple of things you're doing that I really like. One is I started this by saying, here's a way to do this. And I'm picking the way Spring has suggested to do this. And I'm picking the way I have seen it done. So I've kind of merged those two together. That doesn't mean there isn't other ways to do this. And so if you have a way you've always seen, posting it to the channel is great. In the presentation, we're doing it my way, but I'm not going to say that my way is the one and only that's out there. So if you have other things you want to share, feel free to do that. The second thing is I forgot who told me to put the backticks for my code, but I really appreciate learning those little tricks. Slack is still something that I'm getting used to. So anything you have to share about that, you go right ahead. All right. Now, we need to make sure that this is managed by our Spring network. So I went ahead and I went ahead and put it at component. That means it's going to be managed by our Spring network. All right. Now, we are implementing a interface here. So one of the things we want to do is we want to override a particular method that happens to be called resource. Yes, we could have generated this code, but I want to do it this way. No, it's not called resource. Sorry, it's called toResource. Its type is the resource of employees, the thing that we have up here. We're going to call it toResource. Okay, so what we have here is we're overriding this method. It returns a type of resource, which includes employee objects. We're just calling this toResource because that's a good name for it. And that's what they called it in the interface. And it takes one object of a type employee. Great. And it's going to return. What it returns is a new resource collection of employee. And what this needs is the employee class, that it's the employee that it's working with, right? And then it also needs the collection of resources that we want to return. And resources, remember, are the URI that we are pointing to. And so here's what we do. That is not what I wanted. Okay. Now we're going to add another line to this in just a second. All right. So I will say this, even as often as I have used this, I still have to look up all the little details that it needs in here. So I'm going to come up here to the top and I'm going to add a couple of imports that didn't get added automatically. And so one thing that you should get out of this is that there's nothing wrong with having sample code sitting around. And so when we're done with these projects that we're doing in class, they're good things to hang around. So you can go, okay, I want to do something in REST. Oh yeah, I remember we had a project that did that. And you can go back and get some ideas from it. And that's what I do. I just have a series of projects hanging around. And so I want to create something. I go, oh yeah, I've done that before. Let me go look at, project X. All right, so here's what we've got. We've got, what this does is this does a link. Ultimately, all this stuff gets thrown together and it's going to do a link. We're going to create this thing called employee controller. And employee controller is actually going to have all the mapping that we need to do our URIs. We haven't created it yet, which is why it's yelling that it doesn't exist. They're correct. It doesn't exist. We're going to create it in a minute. So this is going to be the link to the thing that we're working on. And then I want to add one other thing here. It's very similar, except in this case, we're going to use a method that's called all, which is the high-level method, the high-level URI, the high-level URI that's going to return all of employees. That actually looks pretty good right there. Now, a couple of things, and that's actually one of the questions was, why is line 7 grayed out? And if you hover over it, it says it's an unused import. Let's verify that. If you go up to code, and you can always go down to this thing called optimize imports, and you can do this on any of your classes that have imports. And it gets rid of the ones that it thinks it doesn't need. Unfortunately, it's wrong in this case. We actually need that one. And so I'm just going to leave it in. That's not depending on where things fall in code, the IDE is not 100% accurate. It's pretty darn close though. So it's worth checking. So if you didn't catch that, that was code, optimize imports, and it will remove the imports it doesn't think it needs. Okay, I'm going to post this out to the thread. And it looked like in here, if I remember right, we needed to create something called employee controller. That seems kind of important. And that is actually by far the biggest class that we're going to create in this whole project. So far, we've just created a bunch of helper classes. Let's get started. Actually, before we do that, I want to create one more helper class. One of the things we're going to add a little bit of error checking in this particular project. And in order to do that, I'm going to need some way to add my own. So when we get an error, the system generates a bunch of messages for us into the log that are useful. But somehow I want to be able to add my own as well. And here's one way to do that. So I'm going to come over here and create a new Java class. And I'm going to call this employee not found exception. Okay, so this is a class. It's going to be called employee not found exception. It's going to actually extend a class that is called runtime exceptions. So what happens is we'll reach a particular runtime exception. We will what's called throw an exception, meaning that we're going to say, okay, we have a problem here. We don't know what to do with it. We're just going to throw out some information to let you know what's going on. And there's a lot of logging information, but actually before the logging information happens, we want to do this. we want to also include in that information that we could not find a particular employee. If we go to search for an employee based off an ID and we can't find it, this will not only put out all of the logging information that we need. That happens when we call super, meaning we are calling the method from the class that this class has inherited from. So whatever runtime exception, whatever its constructor does, this class is going to do it as well. And in addition to that, it's going to add this line that says could not find employee. We're going to find that to be very helpful as we go along. So let's get that. Okay, now let's actually start doing, so we've got all these things in place. We've got, we can do an exception if we need to. We've got some seed data. We've got the data we're working with. That's great, but we haven't actually done anything yet. This is all just setting it up so we can actually do things. So let's do some things. Let's create a new class. And I'm going to call this class Employee Controller. And we had a controller class yesterday as well. This one actually is going to be a REST controller. And there's some fields that we're going to be working with based off of some of the helper classes that we just created. One of the things that we're going to have is this employee repository. Now remember, the employee repository helped us connect our database with helped us connect our objects with the back-end database that we're going to be working with. And so I put this in, and notice it says it hasn't been initialized yet. It doesn't like that it hasn't been initialized because I called it final. Remember, final, you have to initialize somewhere in your class, and you can only initialize it once. Okay, we're also going to need, I talked about this thing that we had that was called an employee resource assembler. That's really just going to make it easier to attach to the end of our JSON objects, this where we found the data. And so we're going to need that thing as well. And I'm just going to call that assembler. And it's going to yell that it's not initialized either. All right. Let's create the constructor for this guy. So I'm going to go to right click. So employee controller, just like most of our classes, are going to need a constructor. And it's when we first create this, we're going to include both of these things for the constructor. There we go. Nice. All right, let's actually start doing some things. I want to go back and show you something about our ID. So if you look at employee class, you'll notice that when we generated this value for its primary key, so add ID, generate value, this generates a long as opposed to an integer. So from here on, and because we decided to use this and we decided to let it generate its long, from here on out, every time we use ID, we're going to have to use a type long. So a couple of things is, if I ever do an int ID, virtually throw things at me to tell me to change it. But this is why we have long everywhere we're working with the IDs. All right, under the employee controller, Now is where we're going to put in some of our mappings. So let's take a look at something. We can have things that are like post, which means to create something. We can have things that get data, which is to read. We can have things that put, and these are just post, get, put, and all. There are a couple of others, are request methods that you can include as part of this controller. And yes, most of us have already been through something like this. So yes, I'm doing the old CRUD thing. There's a patch which does update, modify for collections. There's a delete, which does delete. How about that? All right, our first that we're going to do, our first method that we're going to include in here is just going to be a way to return a listing of all employees. So let's just return a listing of all employees. Now, so we want to do this annotation that's called @get. Now, you could also do this another way. That is actually a shortcut annotation for another annotation. That is that. So I believe yesterday we used this request mapping and it defaults to a get. Really, this shortcut get mapping, and then in a little bit we'll have something that's called put mapping or post mapping. That's the standard way people do this. So I'm going to use that shortcut for what we want. All right. What we want this to do is it's going to be a method, and it's going to return a list of resources. And what these resources are going to be is it's going to be ultimately it's going to be an object, but ultimately that's going to get converted to a JSON object that's then going to get sent back to our REST client. And by it being a resource, it includes not only the data that we want to send back, but also the location of where that data is. And this has to be the object employee. And I'm just going to call this method all. It really doesn't matter whatever I call this method. I could have called it turtle if I wanted to, but that just doesn't make any sense. So we try to pick something that makes sense in the context. And in this case, I decided to use the word all. All right, so I'm going to create a list. And that's another collection that we have. That's another collection that we have in Java, is just a list. And it's going to be a list of resources. And I want to call this employees. And I'm actually going to initialize it with a couple of things. First of all, I want to do from our repository. Remember, our repository is pointing to our collection of employee objects. I'm going to do, and this is something that's built in, I'm going to do a find all. And that's going to find all of the objects for me. And if all we wanted to do was return the objects, we would be great. We would already have found them. It's that simple to find all the objects. But we want to return it in a RESTful JSON object. So let's do that. We're going to first convert it to a stream. A stream is another Java data type that becomes more generic. And Java had this great idea around version 8 to start adding generic data types to it. There are some people that think that is wonderful. It's really simplified coding and it's great. There are some people that said that is not Java. Java is specifically with data types, and this is an abomination to the language. I kind of ride the fence on that, and I make use of these generics when they're helpful, and they're very helpful right here. And I'm using several little shortcut methods here that we may not have seen before. And when I am done, I'll go through and explain what this is doing. Okay, so there's our code. Okay, so we're creating a list of resources of employees. Employees include the employee data that we have, plus some additional, that assembler information that has the resources. This is a way to typecast this is a shorthand way to typecast. And it works great when you're using these more generic type data types. And remember, we had, and we also have to create this to a list because ultimately all this is going to become a list. So what this does, we get the data we want. We get that extra piece of information that we need to tack onto the bottom about where we found the data, and then we convert it to a list. And you're going to be seeing this a lot going forward. You'll notice that this method still is not complete. We have one more thing we need to do, and that is we need to actually return this. And remember that what we're returning is resources, public resources. And here's what we want to return. The employees, great. And then inside of that, well, okay. All right. We need to come up here and add those two imports again, like we did last time. And then we're going to go through and we're going to take a look at something here. So the imports that we need to add, and how did I know these were the imports that I needed to add? To be honest, I looked it up in a program that I had used before. Okay. So now if we come down here, why is this not doing what I want it to do? All right. Okay. So now if we come down here, what we have is did I use the wrong import for that, which is quite possible. All right, so now what we have is we have this thing that we're returning. To the person that reminded me I didn't capitalize my T, thank you. Yes, cases matter. So all of this right here is this method. We created our list of employee data with all that extra stuff that we needed. Then we are sending that list back in a JSON format. That's what all of that mess does. All right. Let's try running this. Why is all in red? What did I miss? Link to, method on, employee.class. Ah, yes, all is actually a method. Thank you. Ah, that's what I was doing. Okay. You know, if I would actually type for my code correctly, this would be much better. I like this a whole lot better. All right, so we are creating this where this whole thing right here creates the link that we need to show to the people, and we're returning the employees list that we created right here. Nice. I like that. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to run this, see if it works. If it does, I'll share this code with you, and then we'll take a break. Except it's not going to work until I fix this find one real quick. So let me come over here and do that. Let's do one more. Let's do this find one. Okay. So let's do one more method. This one is going to be another get mapping, but by the name of find one. What's going to happen here is that we're going to be able to give it an ID. It's going to be very similar to what we just did before, except remember this time we're doing a find one. So that's going to make things a little, I think, a little easier because we don't have to worry about returning a list. We just have to return about the one object. So what I did, what's going to happen here is if we want to return the employee with ID of 4, we would do employees 4. And so that 4 is actually part of something that's called the path variable. And that's going to return the path variable. It is of type long. And in Java, we're going to call it the ID. All right, so we need to return. This is going to end up returning an employee object. I'm going to call it found imp. Again, we have our repository that has some really nice functions built into it. One of them is find by ID. Remember, we had created this as what we call the primary ID, so the employee ID. Well, because we did that, it created automatically for us this thing called find by ID. So all I have to do is give it the ID number, and it's going to go out and find it. But what happens if it doesn't find it? And this is where we created that employee not found exception. So if it doesn't find it, we need to do a or else, so it didn't find it, throw. And what we want, the method that we want to use is we want to create a new employee not found, and we want to send it the ID. And then we're still not done yet. We have to actually return this thing. And what we want to return this time is this found employee, but we want to add all of that cool stuff that we had put into the assembler. That would be the link where we can find this employee, and then the top level link as well for all employees. So we get mapping. We find one using a path variable, which is the long ID. We do a search for the employee. If we find it, it returns it into found empt. If it doesn't, it throws this exception, meaning that everything stops and it displays this on the screen. If that does work, though, then this assembler combines everything together that we need for our REST JSON object and sends it out. All right. We are actually ready to run this. So I'm going to run this, and then I'm going to post the code that we have out to the forum, and then we'll take a break. So let's stop my previous running. Actually, I'm not going to do that. We're going to take a break first. Let me give you this code, and then we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and I'll show you an awful lot about this code and how we're going to actually take a look at it. So that's the code that I just created. I did forget to give you this code, I believe. So let me give you the code for the assembler, or the employee resource assembler. So I just gave you two sets of code, the code we just worked on for the employee controller, plus the code for the employee assembler. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how you can execute and run this. This is kind of fun. Feels like we're getting something real going here. I like this. Yeah, as I said yesterday, I still get excited about this kind of stuff. All right, so let's see what happens. So what I want to do first is I want to run this and see if it's going to work. So let's see. So it's running, it's displaying stuff on the screen. It showed our logs about seating. Now I'm going to go into Google, and I'm going to go to localhost 80, and I think I called it employees, and it didn't like that for some reason. Okay, well, good. Okay, there's a couple of things that I want to do. Okay, first of all, I am going to go to my POM file, and I'm going to take a look at it for a second. And as I scroll down, one thing that I noticed that is not here that I really like to have access to when I'm working with JSON is Jackson. And there are some people that say, oh, if you're still using Jackson, why aren't you looking at X? And there's nothing wrong with X. It's just I like Jackson. It's popular. It's a lot of people use it. I've used it. I'm familiar with it. So I want to add that Jackson dependency to this. Now, before I do that, I want to stop my application. Okay, so let's add our Jackson dependency. Now, if you remember right, remember yesterday, which was, seems like a long time ago, we go to a thing called the Maven repository. And I'm going to go to the Maven repository. I'm going to look up JSON. And I'm going to sort by popular. Jackson has always been the first one that's been popular, although we'll notice that JSON is catching up. I'm going to go to the latest one. This is something we did yesterday. And I'm going to copy this code. So I'm going to copy that code. Okay, so now I have Jackson installed. And remember, Jackson is just a way to help us display JSON objects. All right, let's go see if this fixed our issue. So I want to make sure I've saved everything. And I have put this in, remember, this goes in the POM file. It's XML. And it goes in the POM file, which is what Maven uses to help keep track of our dependencies. Okay, so let's try running this again. Okay. It's localhost 80 employees, and I still have something going wrong. Well, I'm going to switch over and do something else. All right, I want to come in here. We are now back in, and I'll get to that problem in just a minute, but I want to show you this. We are back in IntelliJ. And I'm going to close out some tabs just because I'm having trouble keeping track of things. This is the thing that we're working on the most, so I'm going to leave that open. And I'm going to run a REST API, a REST client inside of IntelliJ. Now, there's a couple of them. The one I'm going to use is actually a little bit of an older version, but I think it works better. So that's what we're going to use. It's up under Tools. So you can go to Tools, go down to Web Services. That's not what I wanted. Go down to HTTP Clients and Test RESTful Web Service. So it was Tools, HTTP Clients, Test RESTful Web Services. And you get something that has our methods right here that you can use. Great. Tells you where we're going to go, what our path is and everything. Let's just play around with this a little bit. There is one thing that I know we need to do. And that is we need to add something to our headers. So I'm going to add down here, add. And for the name, I want it to be content type. And its value, don't really have anything to pull down. I know it's supposed to be application.json. All right, let's see what happens if we just go to that area right there. That's good. That's what I would have wanted to return. So it returned a status that it couldn't find that page, which is great because we haven't implemented a route. Here's our response header that we've got, and there's a response that we get. I like that. Okay, let's actually go to a path. All right, this now actually returns the JSON the way we wanted it. And the reason that it works here and not in Chrome is that I'm returning very specific REST JSON objects. And I don't have a REST client installed on my Chrome, but this is. So that's why we're going to, from here on out, when we're testing REST services, we should be doing it from inside IntelliJ like this. Now, yesterday we saw this and people went, okay, but that's hard to read. We like to have it all nicely laid out. There is a reformat response. So it's this button right there that if you click on that, probably gives you what you're more used to in seeing the way this is laid out. And you can see we include where we found the data plus the overall reference of how we found it. So this is what we would expect from a REST service. This is what our client would expect. And we can see we have a response header. We could even return a single client if we want, a single employee if we wanted. And we get a single employee back. And we could take a look at the listing that way if we wanted to. So this would be the way to review your output of this particular application. Okay, let me show you a couple of other things. So I'm going to stop this right here. So what we did was, what we've done so far is we've added this, we added some get mappings. We added this get mappings. We showed you about the RESTful client that's available inside of IntelliJ, which is a really nice REST client to use. Showed you how you could look at things better. I want to show you a couple of other little tips, things about IntelliJ and about the application. When I am done with this, at around 11, Well, right before class ends, I'll go over what your project is for this afternoon. And then I will be giving you all of this code that I have, including some additional things that you may want to take a look at as far as like how to delete, how to update, and that sort of thing. And they're all very similar to the way this works. And so you can look at that and see how those go. So let's just keep moving on. And then, like I said, I'll be glad to share everything with you, plus a little additional sample code you might want to have around. Okay, let's run this. I'm going to get rid of my client for a minute, and I just want to run this. And it's going to show a bunch of stuff on the console, including the seed data right here, and we can kind of scroll up, and there's some fairly reasonable logging information. You can see what beans got started. You can see that Tomcat got started, a few other things, but not a lot of detail. And we can change that. We can actually have it include way more detail than we'll ever want in our logs to help us trace down what's going on. So let's take a look at that. All right, so I stopped my program from running. I'm going to go under resources. Now, we haven't used this resource folder before, but I'm going to go under resources, and I'm going to open up this thing called application properties. And what I want to do right now is I want to add some code to help us debug something that might be happening in Tomcat. So something that is our the web server that we're running is Tomcat. And what if we need to see what Tomcat is doing? How is it doing handling our data, that sort of thing? How do we go about seeing that? Those logs were not showing up. Let's get them to show up. So I'm going to add all right, so I'm going to add Tomcat. And for Tomcat, I'm going to give it a level called debug. Debug will show everything that Tomcat logs is going to show out to the console. So another logging. One of the things that you will find as you're working with different, especially open source code, is they have a lot of different things they combine, and sometimes there's different naming conventions that go on. To get all the logs from Tomcat, you have to include Tomcat, but you also have to include this Catalina. And in fact, if you're looking for like the log files on your system, they're actually under a folder that got named Catalina Home. Apache for a long time, if you looked for its service, was called HTTPSD. Just, you know, these things you know and you pick up as you go along. So in order to get full Tomcat debugging, you have to include both of these. And we're going to look at Apache as well. Oh, I want to show you, sometimes you will see people put an equal sign there instead of the colon. They do the exact same thing. It's just different syntax. All right, now let's go see what difference that made. All right, so what I want to do is I want to close this. I don't want to look at that anymore. I just want to look at my employee controller. I'm going to scroll through my old logging. All right, let's try running this and see what happens now. What we should find is that we should see a lot more information logged to the console. We still end with our seeding information like we told it to do. That's great. But if you scroll up, you can see that there's a lot more information related to Tomcat that got displayed on our console. And there's an awful lot of information about Tomcat. Tomcat does an awful lot for us. And if you just kind of scroll through this, you can read some of the things that it's actually doing for us. And it's a busy little application out there. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that's a way to turn on logging for Tomcat, but there's other things you can turn on logging for as well. There is something else that I want to show you. I'm going to stop this. And I'm going to close this. All right. One of the questions that comes up is, we've created what we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different classes. Sometimes we've had more than that. How are these all related? Sometimes it's really hard to keep in your head. How are these all related? Well, IntelliJ provides something that might help. If you go over to your folder that you're working with, so in this case, we were working with RESTful imps. I'm going to right click on it. And I'm going to go down to something called diagram. And I want to do a show diagram. And I want to do my Java class. So let me do that again. Right click, diagrams, show diagrams, and then I want to do Java class diagrams. All right, now, so here are all of our classes. We have a lot of things we can do. We can show the fields that are in those classes. And that's kind of helpful without having to go look at the individual classes. You can look at them here. By the way, you can, if you're like me and you have trouble reading some of these small things, you can enlarge it. You can look at, that's constructors. You can look at the methods. What a lot of us would probably like to see, by the way, when you're hovering over this, if it doesn't pop up with the toolbox, if you'll notice at the very far left-hand bottom corner, it shows it as well. If I click this, that is not what I wanted to do. All right, if I click this, it shows you how different objects are related. And again, you can zoom out if you want to. So you can see, for instance, that the C database actually created an employee, actually created 3 of them. So that's something. We know that those 2 are related. The C database also made use of employee repository, remember, to save the data. Now, employee repository has to make use of employee to know what's happening out there. So this is a way you can get an overall diagram of what your classes are doing. One thing I would recommend is, now that you know that this exists, you can go look at our dependency injection that we did last Thursday. In fact, let me see if I can quickly pull that one up. If I remember right, that was it. Yeah, I just want to open it up. So when we did all that stuff with dependency injection, So remember, it's you find the folder, you right click on it, diagrams, show diagram, and we want the Java class one. And there I have all the dependencies enabled. So you can see we had a main class that created all sorts of things. And this is just a way to look at it. One thing you can do if you don't like where these things are located is you can move them around. And you can actually move them around to a spot where they will make absolutely no sense. And but you can have fun. You can get mad at one and you can just go, you can throw it way off of the screen and not worry about looking at it if you were mad at that class for some reason. So there's a lot of stuff you can do and play around with it. This is not at all going to hurt your code. This is purely just a visual for you to play around with. And then if you get tired of it, you can just close that tab and you're back to where your code was. Okay, let's go back to our project we're working on for today. And I believe I called it RESTful Imps. Okay, so this is the code that we're working on today. I want to do one more thing. I'm going to do one more piece of coding for us. I want to do a replace employee. So what we're going to do, and again, I've got other code that I'll share with you, but for right now, I just want to do this one. So we are back in our project. We're in employee controller, and we're going to put something in that's called a put mapping. And in this case, what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to either add or update an employee depending on whether we find that ID or not. So if we find the ID, it gets updated. If we don't find the ID, we add it. And the reason that I want to do this one is it's got a couple of little gotchas in here. So this actually needs to return a response entity. Now, what is the class that's going to go inside this response entity? I don't know. And this is another one of those generic things that they have added. It's a wildcard class. And so in this case, we can get away with saying, I don't know. We'll worry about that later. So I want to replace an employee. Now, what happens with replace an employee? We need to get, this is going to be now getting data from the user that we're going to be using. So we need to make sure, and it's going to come across in what is called our request body. So our request body is going to contain an employee that I'm just going to call new imp. So we're going to have this request body that's going to come in with our REST request, and it's going to be in a JSON format. And that's going to go into the request body, and we're going to read that in using the annotation request body. We have to have some place to put it in Java so we can work with it. We're going to put it in a variable called new object, which is of type employee. Now, we also need to get the ID from the path variable. Now, this one is interesting because this guy has to throw an exception, and you have to tell it that it's going to do this. And it's going to throw what is called a URI syntax exception. So if for some reason the syntax that we get in is not correct, it's just going to die and say, I give up. And it's going to do that nicely by calling a URI syntax exception. All right. Now, do some standard stuff here. We want to have, we're going to create what I'm going to call an updated employee. All right, so updated employee is of type employee. We're going to do from our repository, we're going to do our friend find by ID, which we did just a minute ago. And we're going to try to find the ID. Now, one of two things can happen. Either it can find it, which means we have a replace situation going on, or if it doesn't find it, we're going to actually add it to the list. So we're going to do this right here. Okay, so here's what's happening is we're going to take, so the way this find by ID does with working with puts, we're going to take the new employee, we're going to put it inside of a employee object that's then going to get forwarded on, and it's going to get added to our database. So let's do that. So we've got several things we need to worry about. So in this employee, and now this is something that we had. I can't just tell it to add the current one. I can't tell it to just work with the current one because that would be working. Let me type. So we want to do a set name. And in this case, we're going to get the name from new employee. That looks good. Now, we need to create this employee. We need to get, see, the problem that we have is this employee that comes in, we don't have that data in a format that Java's going to understand it. So we need, and this is a different object anyway than the employee that we're actually trying to update. So we need to stuff the data from this employee into this employee that we need to update. Then this one would actually become this object, which goes away when we end this method. So that object would go away, and we haven't actually stored anything. So we lose all of this good work. But let's keep going. So now we just have to do this for each one of the values that we get. So we need to do get last name, get first name. We need to do the whole thing. At the end of all of this, at the end, so we have this employee that we're working with. This is the data. This is the object that comes across from the users. This represents the object that we're updating. And we need to update the values that are in them, not just the thing itself. And yes, there are different ways of doing this. This just happens to be a very straightforward way to do it that is fairly easy, fairly straightforward to understand. So what we're doing is we're taking the values from one object, stuffing them into the other. All right. Now, we need to actually return something here. And what we need to return is that object that we just worked with saved in our database. All right, let's keep going. Now, what happens if we can't find it? If we can't find it, we're going to do a r else get And what we want to get in this case is, we're just going to take new imp. And inside of that, we're going to set the ID from the ID that we took in from our URI. And then we just want to return that guy. And see, in this case, we're only working with one object, the new one we got in. There's not a separate object that's sitting out there that we need to update. This time, we're just adding a new object. Now, we're not quite done yet. We still now need to return something to the user. And so we are going to do that real quick. And I am cognizant of the time. Just bear with me. We may run a couple of minutes over. So in this case, we have to actually return something to the client. What we return is a response entity. So that's a response that we're going to give to the client. And we need to have a some sort of proper header and links that it has, and then it needs to have a body that it's going to return. And that's what all of this mess does right here, is actually return the things to the client. All right. Let's try running this because I want to show you something about the REST client, which is why we did all of this. And I will be giving you all of this code when we're done, including the code on how to delete. All right, so let's go to our REST client. And this time, what we're going to do is we're going to do a put. And then when you do a put in the request body, your JSON object needs to go here. So it's going to be something like, and then you need to have it for each one of the fields. But the big point that I wanted to say was that your JSON object goes right here in text. One of the things that I found to be helpful was to do something like this. Do a get. And I want to get employee one. That's great. And here is employee one. And I'm just going to copy the data for employee one. And then when I come back to my request, I can paste that data there. And now I just have to do some manipulation to get things cleaned up. And I just found that saved me a whole lot of typing. So let's change Steve Green's name to Steve Mitchell. And let's see if we got all of our code right. Look at that, it got changed. If we go back and do a get, it still comes back with Mitchell. So that was a very quick overview of how to do a put and how to put the data in there, but it's fairly standard the way REST clients work. So this afternoon, the project that you're working on this afternoon, if you'll give me about 2 minutes, I'll quickly go over this. The project that you're working on this afternoon is Java dogs. It's and I just posted it in our thread. It's Java dogs, and basically it's what we just did, but using different data sets. So this data set happens to be dogs, and we actually did this in class using these dogs. Uh, but we're going to run through the standard gets, put, post, delete, and then some things that you can try with, some things we didn't specifically discuss in class, but I think given what you know, you should be able to do. So I would certainly give those a shot, those couple of things at the end, which says to delete dogs given a breed as opposed to just an ID. And make sure that when you're adding dogs, that the names are unique. The names of the breeds are unique. So you couldn't have, so here we have new dogs, bulldog, and the way it's set up right now, you could very easily add another bulldog that has even these exact same characteristics. What we would like to do is to make sure you only have one bulldog in there. So if someone tries to add a bulldog, it just wouldn't work. It would fail. And right now, we don't have to worry about it failing nicely. It can just throw out an exception to the screen. Most of the time, we're going to let our client worry about the failing, but we'll get into that later. So that's where we're headed. And that is the REST API in Java, at least one way to do it. So thank you, and good luck this afternoon.